So I'm trying to make a short video about some things I believe are important. And there's so many interruptions in trying to do this here. It seems like no matter what direction I travel and how far I go, trying to find a secluded area with no sounds of man-made things. Every direction all around me has major roads and highways with loud car engines and sounds from the highway. There's overhead flying airplanes and helicopters, jumbo jets in the background. So in between all of these interruptions, I'm really trying to convey a simple message. So this is one of the areas I like to go to hang out, especially during the summer months when there's fair weather. Today it's raining. There isn't many people out here because there's not much to do in the rain in the great outdoors. It may help understand a little bit more about the homeless reality compared to the stereotype that most people have. Especially to the adventure campers who believe it's a grand adventure to come outdoors as a homeless person and see the sights of the world. I remember so many times being out in the wilderness in my tent. Everything I owned was waterlogged. My clothes, my shoes, my tent, my sleeping bag, my blanket, everything in my backpack, my personal belongings, my favorite book, everything was ruined by water. The other reality is it's very easy to get sick. The most difficult thing to do is to stay healthy in an environment like this, at least on an ongoing basis. Most people go out adventure camping for a weekend and bring the family and the tent and the hot dogs and have a great experience. Even in foul weather, it's easy enough to have a great experience if you're close enough to a vehicle or shelter like this. But as a homeless person, there really is no shelter to run to. Isn't it true that a minor issue can become a major problem really fast? Such as a minor cut on the skin can become a major infection without the right medications to deal with it properly, especially being in the outdoor elements like this for a long period of time. Another issue was keeping my food safe. So many times I would go to the mission or the soup kitchen and I would get an extra serving and I would bring it back and stash it in my tent for later. So many times I would come back to my tent and realize that a rodent had chewed into those plastic containers, contaminating my food. I remember one time I had a ritual every morning of making my coffee, and I loved my coffee. That was my morning routine. I would boil my water, make my coffee, put just the right amount of sugar and cream in it, and that was my start of the day. Eventually, the ants got into my sugar container, and by the time I realized that I had been eating sugar that had ants, I ate my sugar anyway. I used that sugar for several days until eventually the ants were so concentrated within my sugar bowl, I had to throw it away. That was rather humiliating for me to admit later on, that I actually used the sugar contaminated by several ants. Probably 60 or 70 ants were inside of my container, but I was using that sugar anyway because I wanted my coffee. It's one of those minor issues that became a major problem. On the topic of minor things that become major issues, I'd like to talk a little bit about those personality disorders that I had mentioned in my book. People that do have personality disorders, they have a particular challenge. The main issue is we try to act like we don't have a problem. And that turns into a major issue by not dealing with the issues as they are in reality. For the most part, I have learned to handle my daily situations in a much more emotionally healthy way than I ever did before. But that's because I had a really great desire to understand and cope with what they called my personality disorders. When I actually realized I had bipolar anger and bipolar depression and what they called histrionic personality disorder, that's not what I called them. I called them some of the most profane things because of how they influenced my life in such a negative way. One of the main causes of my own personal homeless experiences has been my inability to cope with the situations that happened in my daily life in an emotional, healthy way. In other words, I would get angry at the slightest thing, and I was so pessimistic and angry and generally rude to people that they didn't want to be around me very much. Most people were aware of my personality disorders much more and much sooner than I was. But throughout my book, I try to make it clear during the autobiography section of my book that my periods of homelessness were directly related to my inability to cope with my daily environments more than having the ability to pay rent and earn an income. What I'm trying to touch on the surface here is most people that are homeless have a reason for being homeless. That's why my book is called Homeless for a Reason. Generally speaking, every person has a reason for the things they do or the things that they are unable to accomplish. In their mind, it's a justifiable reason, whether or not everyone else agrees with it or believes it. If the person having the difficulty believes that their reason is legitimate, then it is in fact legitimate. In their mind, it's legitimate. And I tell the truth here and now. The personality disorders that I was experiencing were so traumatic in my psychological understanding of the world around me that I felt victimized by everything in the world around me to the point where it seriously made me angry. It's generally a misunderstood myth that homelessness is an economic problem. A certain percentage of homelessness and homeless people is a direct result of an economic problem, such as being laid off from work or an injury that prevents them from being able to work. But when I became homeless in 2005 and again in 2007, in the metropolitan area of downtown Portland, Oregon, I was in close contact with literally thousands of people that were homeless in some way. And the interesting thing was, during the spring of 2005, when I first decided to start writing a book about homelessness, I was sitting down trying to interview homeless people and really get their story. And the fact of the matter was, they weren't telling me the truth. The majority of people that I interviewed, especially with pen in hand, exaggerated their stories so drastically that I almost knew instinctively that they were not being honest. And when I became a homeless person, and I was living outdoors as a homeless person, it was very easy to gain their confidence. And they began to tell me the truth of their stories, even when they didn't realize I was interviewing them. Because instead of a formal interview, really we were hanging out as friends at that time. But my personality disorders interrupted my daily life to the point where I couldn't hold a job for long periods of time. Even the friends that I made were usually temporary friends because, like most people, I would put on this persona of being in control, an emotionally stable person. But underneath all of that, I felt emotionally ruined by the situations in my life that I could not control. But the way that I expressed it was through anger. The way that I expressed my dissatisfaction about things in my life was severe depression. Most people, generally speaking, do not want to be around somebody so pessimistic and so angry so many times during a typical day. Generally speaking, during one simple day, I would experience anger and depression on a regular basis, to the point where it was almost impossible to find me in a good mood. So I've moved outside like this because we had a serious downpour of rain that lasted quite a while. Now it's a very low-light situation under that pavilion. But I would like to finish my message about personality disorders and being unable to cope with normal life day to day. So my message by making this video is to encourage the average person that wants to understand homelessness deeper than their original understandings or the general stereotypes of the average working person. Because I have now experienced homelessness in almost every category of homelessness and in each environment, without weather extremes such as the Arctic environment and desert climates. I have experienced homelessness in several states of the United States and in different situations, from couch surfing to literally living outdoors in a tent in these types of weather conditions. And I stand here now as a person with a respectable place in the working class society, as it was before I realized I had such traumatic experiences that caused me to have personality disorders that I was unable to cope with in my daily living. My main message is homelessness is not just a condition of economic trouble. For some people it is. If they receive an eviction notice because they're unable to pay the rent and they have to move out of their home or their apartment, it may not be just as simple as finding another home or finding another apartment or locating another job. It could be a very serious problem that relates with not being able to cope with daily life the way that average people do. And when this happens, they become homeless. They interpret their homeless situation the way that they view the world, with their psychological difficulties in coping with the reality that they understand. So homelessness for each individual becomes a very different experience. There is no such thing as a simple definition for what homelessness is. And there's definitely no single answer for how to resolve it, because every individual experiences it differently, and every experience is interpreted by the way that individual sees the world around them. This is more serious than it seems, and like homelessness, most average people have a misconception and very wrong stereotypes about people with disorders. We tend to think that someone that has any sort of disorder needs medication and they're unable to cope with society on a day-by-day basis. And some of those individuals most definitely are. But in my case, I realized after doing extensive research about bipolar anger, bipolar depression, and histrionic personality, and a list of other disorders that I was trying to understand at the time, my condition of being angry and depressed on a regular basis was a learned pattern of thinking that I developed throughout the years. And what it meant was I would instantly become nearly irate, angry about something that I did not agree with or something that I did not understand. And I would act out that anger. And then I would become triggered into a long episode of depression. And what this did was, every day that I tried to go to work and be around other people in a normal working environment, I intimidated them with my anger. They didn't like being around me. And my depression was always a very negative, dragging down experience for other people to be around me at that time. And I was unable to hold a job for very long periods of time. In fact, probably in a period of 3 or 4 years, I experienced 8 or 10, maybe 12 different employers. Because as soon as I would become offended, I would just leave. Or I would become so angry and irate, they would have no choice but to terminate my employment right where I stood. This became a very consistent pattern in my life, where I was unable to associate with other people on a regular basis without offending someone, or without being the real drag down kind of guy to be around. And my 3 children, whom did not live with me at the time, it affected them in such negative ways that even now, 10 years after the fact, we still have emotional relationship issues that are very difficult to wrestle with. So throughout my book, I capture my experiences as a homeless person during a period of time that I did not even realize I was the one that was unable to cope with my surroundings on a daily basis. I literally believed there was some kind of mysterious force keeping me from being able to perform in the workplace and keeping me from being able to connect with my children in a meaningful way. Through all of that, I learned how to overcome my homelessness once and for all. So hopefully what I've produced by writing this book is not just a boring documentary with statistical information about homelessness and poverty in America. It's actually a very realistic account of what happened to me as a homeless person, looking through the eyes of the person that I've described, with all of my psychological misunderstandings and my emotional problems at the time, to learning how to cope with those issues and being able to secure a job and keep a job for longer periods of time until eventually I now have a very respectable place in the working class society. My loud and clear message to the average homeless person out there trying to understand how to end their homeless situation once and for all is that I am another example of an individual that came from extremely trying circumstances. Some of the worst imaginable emotional crisis situations that a person could experience. And I did succeed. It took me a very long time, but I became personally determined. And with that attitude, I found a way to succeed. And my message of hope goes out to anyone. If you find the right mentor and you have the determination to succeed, you can and you will.